Dr. Tim Perkins grew up in Northeast Vermont, helping on his grandfather's farm and sugaring operation. He received bachelor's degrees in forest ecology and geology, and master's and doctoral degrees specializing in forest physiology from the University of Vermont. He was appointed director of the Proctor Maple Research Center in 1996, where his work centers on understanding sap flow, increasing yields from maple, and sustainability of tapping. He holds 5 patents on various maple devices and practices. He has authored or co-authored over 35 scientific journal papers, written numerous articles in the maple industry literature, and has done hundreds of presentations throughout the maple producing region. He was an author and co-author of the 2nd edition of the North American Maple Syrup Producers Manual, and is a lead editor and contributor author of several chapters in the upcoming 3rd edition. Dr. Perkins received the 2003 Person of the Year from the Vermont Maple Industry Council, the Golden Maple Leaf Award in 2008 from the IMSI, the Distinguished Service Award from the North American Maple Syrup Council in 2009, the Sumner Hill Williams President's Cup in 2011 from Vermont Maple Industry, the Richard G. Haas Distinguished Service Award from the North American Syrup Council in 2013, the IMSI President's Award in 2018, and will be inducted into the North American Hall of Fame in 2021. Thank you very much for being here, Tim, and take it away.
Well, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay, well, I'm going to assume that you can hear me. If not, then go ahead and raise your hand. And okay, great. So I'm going to talk about lots of different factors that affect sap yields in maple trees, work that's been done over the past decade or so at the Proctor Center, some of it which is quite new. It's important to recognize that I am not the only one doing this work. Dr. Abby Vandenberg collaborates on almost everything. Mark Iselhart, Wade Bosley are also involved to a great deal, as are other technicians and students throughout the years. So this is really a collaborative effort of many different people, and I'm going to show some research from other sites as well. So with that, we'll get started. And if I can get my screen actually moving here. Okay, well, just wanted to mention that this isn't this line of research on looking at how various things affect yield from maple tap holes is not new at all. It's been going on for a long time. This is a paper from 1959 by Marvin and Green at the UVM Proctor Center, looking at the same thing, factors affecting the yield. And at the time, they were talking about the effects of new techniques, which is something we do quite frequently still. The major difference now is that a lot of this work that we're doing relates to vacuum. A lot of the earlier work was done when tubing was first coming out on gravity flows. So a lot of what I will mention is going to be on vacuum flows. A lot of the research that's been done previously on gravity flow in trees is still quite valid. And we do occasionally do some things that have to do with gravity flow or that pertain to both type of situations. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to maximize sap yield in a sustainable fashion and also do it in a way that makes money for maple producers. So our objective is to use practices that are going to enhance sap yields to get them the highest levels possible. But we also want to reduce the impacts to the tree so that we can make sure that maple production is something that can be done for a long period of time. We aren't impacting tree health, and we continue to get good yields. And so it's important that producers really understand how the different decisions that they make are going to influence sap yield, how they're going to affect the tree, and how economic is it. And that is largely going to depend, the last thing on economics, going to depend upon the individual producer and how they want to operate and what their goals are. So producers should know the different options that they can choose from and select practices that are going to produce the highest sustainable yields for them while maximizing their net profit. And some people, it really isn't so much the a requirement that they make money. Some people are doing this as a hobby or just as a sideline business and don't need to make a lot of profit off their practices. But for those who want to maximize their profits, we can help you with that. So we want to use best management practices and reduce the errors that impact sap yields. There are many things that we want to do that are best management practices, but then there are some other things that are just small errors that tend to add up over time that people may do that we want to try to avoid. So really the objective is to get more sap from your trees and lose less by what you're doing. And just as an example, this is a production from the UVM Proctor Maple Research Center from 2004 through this past year. On the axis, it's going in gallons per tap, and if you prefer the pounds per tap, that's the number above each bar. Our minimum target each year is a half a gallon per tap. Our long-term average over this time period is 0.6 gallons per tap, or about 6.6 pounds per tap. And this is not because we're doing anything particularly experimental or magical, or that we have a tremendously amazing site. If you've ever visited the Proctor Center, we're high up in the hills, shallow soils, a lot of wind, the windiest place in Vermont. And our trees really are not the best trees. They're not huge for the most part. Our average diameter is only around 12 inches. So this is something that is achievable by paying a lot of attention and using best management practices. It's also something, when we started out with this, we were only tapping about 1,500 trees. The number across the top of the graph shows the progression in our number of taps that we've been using. So we've gone from about 1,500 up to over 5,000. Will be probably closer to 6,500 in the next few years. And we've been able to maintain those high levels throughout that time period by paying a lot of attention to best management practices and doing the best that we can do. The only year that we had a year that we did not meet a minimum target was 2012. And I think any of you who've been in this game for a while recognize that 2012, we had record high temperatures in the middle of March that just shut everything down. Everything was buddy after that point. And we don't make commercial syrup for the most part. We may make a little bit at the very end of the season, the last day, but as soon as we hit that, we stop. So when we're talking about best management practices, we want to make sure that we distinguish those from maple folklore or maple practice that you may have heard. So things like always tap on the south or the west side of trees, or always tap over a large root or under a large branch. All of these various things that you may hear from other sugar makers are largely, common sense type things that when you start looking at them closely and actually doing the research on them, don't bear up. So I certainly hope that you don't always preferentially tap on the south side of trees or over a large root or a large branch. All of these things really don't hold up when you actually do the research on them. And we've done a lot of research on these various things, as have others over the last 50 years. And these things that you just hear time and time again just are not actually valid. What they do tend to produce, however, is things like this, which is, I hope you can spot very quickly some of the errors in this. These are, this is a tree that obviously has been over tapped. There's two times as many taps on that tree as there should be. People are using large spouts. They're always tapping on this face of the tree. The drop lines are too short. So what they've ended up with is a section of wood that is essentially dead. And they're not getting much of anything out. They're obviously going to be hitting stain every time that they tap in this area. And so when you do things like this over a period of time, you see your sap yields drop off and you wonder why, and you think, well, maybe I need to put in more taps. And so they go and add another tap on a tree like this. And that's just not helpful. It's not going to produce more sap. In order to really understand what's going on, we have to look at a few things. And so I'll talk about sap flow. And this is a micrograph from a sugar maple section. The really big tubes there that you see, the big pipes, are the vessels that sap actually flows through. So it's the wood of maple trees is very unique in certain ways. Not going to go through the whole freeze thaw mechanism. Most people are probably familiar with that. But just wanted to mention that yield from a taphole is related to factors that impact the amount of sap within a stem that we can get to and get out of the tree. So things like wood anatomy, these vessels or pipes in the tree that we actually collect sap from. The size of the tree dictates how big the reservoir is, how much sap is actually held within that tree. Size of the taphole is going to affect the number of functional vessels severed, but not always in a straightforward way. The depth of the taphole, same sort of thing. The number of functional vessels, how many of those vessels are what we call hydraulically conductive. The older the wood gets, the less hydraulically conductive it is. The newest wood is the most hydraulically conductive, but in maple, wood stays quite conductive for many, many, many years. So it isn't just the absolute youngest rings that are contributing to sap flow. Time of season is going to dictate how much of the stem is frozen or thawed, or whether or not we're getting these freeze thaw periods that induce pressure and flow. The vacuum level certainly is going to affect how much lateral flow and vertical flow we get, and I'll talk about that in a moment. How the tree actually freezes. If it's a very, very quick freeze, not much recharge happens compared to a nice slow freeze where you get full recharge in the tree. So that's sort of akin to fast freezes, maybe only filling the tank part way, quarter of the way, half of the way, and a nice slow freeze, you fill the tank, all these tree vessels completely with water. How long the flow event is, so how much you can actually get out of there before the tree freezes up again or pressure drops off, and the extent of the flow event, so how much of the stem is actually involved, whether just the south side thaws out or the north side thaws out or freezes, is important. And then there are lots and lots of other factors, soil moisture, temperature, that come into play. So a lot of the time we think about maple sap flow as this pipe model. We think of a maple stem as a pipe stuck in the ground and filled with liquid. And really it's fairly similar to that, except instead of one big pipe, it's millions or billions of little pipes all connected together. So if we put a taphole in that, we're going to get a certain amount of sap out, and the amount of sap we get is related to how big the pipe is, how well it can flow out both downward and sideways, and how long a period of time it's going to flow out before it freezes up. So there's just a very simple way of thinking about it can really help us understand. So when we look at gravity flow in a tree, so people are using buckets or bags or gravity tubing, during a thaw, the sap is mostly moving vertically, and it's moving down during a thaw. And it's coming down towards the taphole from a fairly limited area in the trunk. There's not a lot of sideways movement of sap. It's mostly the area right above the taphole. So the yield from a tree under gravity during any one flow period is going to depend upon a bunch of things, including how long the flow lasts. If it's a really short flow, it's only going to come from a very small area. If it's a bigger flow, it's going to come from a longer area. Those very, very long flows, it's going to come mostly above, but then as the pressure drops off, there may be some migration of sap from one side of the tree to the other. In contrast, vacuum can move sap both down and up. So early in the flow, there may be sap that moves preferentially downward, but after a period of time, it can actually move upward as well, and it can be pulled sideways. So the entire sap reservoir that we're tapping into is much larger, which is why vacuum can produce larger yields. We've seen that vacuum can extend completely across very, very large stems when the thaw is prolonged for a period of time. So we're just getting a much bigger reservoir that we're able to get into. And we actually see during very long thaw periods that at a period of time, we're getting sap flow almost entirely upward, where we're pulling sap right out of pulling water right out of the soil into the roots, up through the stem and right out of the taphole, and it's not ever even getting to the crown. During that phase, you see that sap sugar content really starts to drop off because we're just diluting what is in the stem already with new fresh water from the soil. So the second aspect besides sap flow we need to think about is wounding. If we can see within the tree what's going on. This is a maple stem that Dave Foligno from Starksboro, Vermont had turned to remove the bark. And you can sort of get this X-ray vision of what is going on within the tree. And you can see what happens when you actually do tap a tree. Tapping creates a wound. That wound, the effect is that the tree tries to wall off that wound. It's building this layer of protection around this wounded area to prevent there from being infection and infection spreading throughout the tree. When that happens, the tree creates this stained area within the tree. You can't see it from the outside, but it's certainly there on the inside. The taphole never fills in. It's there forever, as long as until the tree rots or is burnt or whatever. The important part about that stain is that sap will no longer move through that area. It's non-conductive, or NCW, non-conductive wood. So if you tap into an area of that stain, you're not going to get sap from it. You may partially tap into a stained area. The amount of sap you get out is going to be dependent upon how much of the stain you actually hit. So if half the taphole hits stained wood and the other half doesn't, you'll get roughly about half as much sap out of that taphole as you would from a clean, fresh taphole. The size of the stain itself is related to both the diameter and the depth of the taphole, and then the length going up and down is dependent upon more the wood anatomy, the size of the vessels. So this isn't one vessel that's being affected. There are many, many vessels. Wood vessels, the big pipes in maple, tend to be, down in the millimeter type length sizes, but they can extend for, upwards of 30 centimeters. And so that ends up producing the long stain compared to what happens in the horizontal directions and radial directions. It's important to recognize, if you look at this too, that taphole's staining is not perfectly straight up and down. It's mostly straight, but maple wood has a little bit of grain to it, and each tree is a little different. So it's going to bend and twist a little bit, and it's going to taper off as it gets further and further from the wound. The other thing that's important is that the sap in the sugar is not coming from just that stained area. There are two different processes. Sap flow, the sap is coming from a larger area within the tree. The stained area is an area the tree is responding and walling off, and they overlap, but they're not exactly the same. The number of areas that we have within a tree are going to be determined upon the tapping intensity. So how many taps you put in each year into a stem, how often you tap that tree. And the wounds eventually get buried over by new growth, and we can see that at the taphole level. When tapping, it's important to avoid those old tapholes, because if you tap into those stains again, you're not going to get as much sap as you would from a good white wood taphole. So that brings up the concept of the tapping band. The tapping band is the area within the tree that we can reach with a drop line. And drop lines were originally developed to prevent sap from being sucked back into the tree by the tree as it froze up at night, but they're useful for being able to spread that wound around. The drop lines enable us to move all around the tree and spread the wound out. So we have less chance of hitting stained wood when we put in a new taphole. They should be long enough to reach all around the tree if it's a single tap tree, or at least half of the face of the tree if it's a two tap tree. The diameter of the tree, the effective diameter of the tree for tapping purposes, should be adjusted downward for obvious wounds. So if you have a tree where it's got, a third of it on one side, or a third of the tree, one whole side is maybe impacted by some type of old wound, you have to think about that tree as being only about half or a third of the size reduced. It's not able to move as much sap. It's not functionally as large as it appears to be. By spreading out the area that we're tapping and creating stain within, we reduce the chances of hitting old stain. Okay, so now we're going to move on to some of the factors that directly impact sap yield. And one of the biggest ones is tree size. Tree size, again, going back to that pipe model, bigger pipe, more sap. Just kind of makes sense. This is a study we did, and it's continued for several years since, looking at sap yield as a function of tree diameter. And essentially what this shows is that very, very small trees produce very, very little sap. We do not recommend you tapping those small trees for production. If your idea is, well, I'm going to tap them because I'm going to thin them later, you're better off thinning them now, letting the trees that could be released, get released, grow, get bigger, and produce more sap. You're just not going to get much sap or very sweet sap from those very small, suppressed or understory trees. As the trees get larger, yield increases, and it tends to vary within a range that's dictated by each individual sugar maker's practices, whether it's vacuum or sanitation or different tapping practices, and the weather for the season. So you can see that each of these seasons varied a little bit. 2016, 2017, the trend is pretty similar, and it's just that line is just going to move up and down from year to year depending upon those different factors that sugar makers do. But in general, what you're going to find is that under vacuum and using best management practices, you're going to get about 2 gallons more sap or half a pound of syrup more per inch of diameter increase. So getting your trees to grow, keep them thin, keeping competition really low, making sure you're tapping only the dominant and co-dominant trees will ensure that you're getting higher yields. Another thing that's very straightforward is vacuum. If you use vacuum, you get more sap because you're accessing this bigger area within the tree. You're accessing more of the reservoir. You're able to get it out faster during any one flow and get more of it. And it's just a very simple linear relationship, very, very tight. The more vacuum you pull, the more sap you get. This research that we did sort of led to the saying of 5 to 7% increase in sap yield per 1 inch of vacuum that you increase. One thing we hear frequently is that, well, if you pull vacuum, you're getting a larger stain in the tree, you're moving ice around, that's rupturing vessels, that's damaging the tree. And it really isn't. It doesn't cause any additional damage to the tree if you use vacuum. Okay, and then another thing, effective number of taps on a lateral line. The more you have on the lateral line, the less sap you're going to get. Functionally, the best you can get is 1 tap per lateral. We're not recommending you do that. It's just too costly. So a good approach is to use the saying of strive for 5, no more than 10 taps on a lateral line. And speaking with a lot of the commercial installers out there, when they put in new systems, they tend to keep down to about 3 taps per lateral line, especially their own woods. They'll do whatever you ask them to do, but they know that they can maximize production by going to a lower number of taps on a lateral line. Now, this is for vacuum. On gravity systems, you can go higher. You can go maybe up to 25, 30 taps on a lateral line. But if you're installing your tubing system with gravity now, think you might want to go to vacuum. Just recognize that if you just add vacuum to a system that was designed for gravity flow, it's not going to work. And this again also is 5/16" tubing systems. 3/16" tubing systems are different. In that case, many times you want more taps on a lateral line to develop that natural vacuum. Sanitation is another area, and I've talked about this for the last 12 years or so. This is a collection of all the different studies looking at, in red, just changing spouts each year on tubing systems under vacuum. Green are changing to a check valve spout, and so it says check valve plus spout. Those are the two different effects. You're getting both the check valve and the new spout effect if you use new check valves each year. And then in blue is the spout and drop. If you change spouts and you change drops, then you're going to get the biggest increase in production, 72%. So if you just looked at this, you'd say, wow, changing spouts and drops, I'll do that every now and then, and that will give me the highest yield. Well, the problem is, even if you're putting a new drop in, you're going to get great production the first year. The second year, it's going to drop off by about 10%. Third year, it's going to drop off by another 10 or 15%. So over time, what you find is averages is something like this. A spout alone on a vacuum tubing system produces about a 32% increase in sap yield. Using a check valve will produce about 63%, 60 to 65%. And there's a lot of variation from year to year, depending on a lot of different factors. And then the average, if you use a 3-year drop line replacement interval, is about 61. So check valves and spout and drops on a 3-year interval, which is what most people tend to do, end up being very, very similar in terms of sap yield. However, it's a lot more costly to replace a drop than it is to replace just a spout, even with a check valve spout. So the little box on the bottom of each bar shows the net profit that you actually can get, assuming a certain amount of sap yield and what your sap is actually worth. So about 81 cents, just putting a new spout in. If you're doing nothing else, put a new spout in each year, new plastic spout. Spout and drop, if you're doing them on a 3-year replacement interval, going to get you about $1.50 each year. If you're on that 3-year drop line interval, check valve replacement each year gets you a little over $2. So you pick the way you want to go. We've looked at a lot of different other types of sanitizers. Really, the one that seems to work the best is bleach. The problem with bleach, if you're using just standard chlorine bleach, is that it attracts rodents, and doing this work, it's always our systems that are cleaned with bleach that have the biggest problems. Moving on to timing of tapping. Timing of tapping depends largely upon where you are, at least in northern Vermont, northern New York, and I would expect at least a good part of Wisconsin to be similar. We find that as long as we use good sanitation, and as long as you're using vacuum, tapping in mid-January is a good thing for sap yields, as long as we're ready to collect and process sap at that time. If we wait until February, you've missed a few possible flows that happen in late January and early February. If you wait until later in March, the sap might run a little bit better on those Tapholes towards the very end of the season, but your production actually tends to be lower. So for us, we tend to tap starting about mid-March. That's pretty typical for our area of the woods. If you're on gravity, completely different situation. With gravity, you want to only tap right before when you expect the season to begin. When you expect the season to begin is a difficult thing to actually know. The best predictor over time tends to be the long-term weather temperature average, but it's a good idea to keep an eye on things and just see whether or not it looks like it's going to be warming up. In terms of the long-range average that you see from some websites, they tend not to be very good. the line between flow and no flow being right at that freezing point, they just aren't good enough to be able to predict that over an area. And then there are a lot of microsite differences. So if you have a cold sugar bush, it's going to have a big difference than a sugar bush that's warmer. So on gravity systems, delay your tapping until just prior to when you expect good sap flows. Okay, on the dropline length, this is a survey we did on Maple Trader, Sugar Bush Info some years ago. And it shows that most people are using drop lines averaging about 30 inches. Back in the 60s, it was 15 to 18 when tubing was first starting to be used, because the tree can only pull sap back about 15 inches. So if you use one larger than that, and that was on the gravity flow, if you use drop lines longer than 15 inches, you were all set. 1980s with the tapping band issues, people started using longer drop lines, but now it's gotten longer. Drop line length is important because it directly affects how much of the tapping band you can actually access. And you want to be able to make sure your tapping band is large enough so you're not tapping into stained wood. The trend has certainly been toward longer drops, and the current recommendation is for 36-inch drop lines. Now, that even accounts for small trees. People say, well, I just have a small tree. I could just put on a short drop line. Well, with a small tree and a short drop line, you're only be able to access a small area of the tapping band. You want to be able to access a very large part. Small trees, you're gonna utilize all the tapping band very quickly with short drop lines. So make sure, even on a small tree, that you're using a long enough drop line. Continuing on with drill bits, if we look at maple tapping bits, they are not the same as a standard bit. Maple tapping bit is designed especially to stay on point, get the wood chips out fast, and so you can move faster through the woods. A regular drill bit has a larger angle, so it can walk a little bit, and it takes longer to actually remove the wood chips. So, you know, I would encourage you to use a maple tapping bit and make sure that it's sharp, because research has been done that shows that dull drill bits just tear and crush vessels. They don't cut them cleanly. That makes more of an area for microbes to begin to grow, and it reduces sap yield. It's just overall not good. A sharp bit is really cheap insurance. It's, you know, the very first step you do, you don't want to do it wrong. So use a good bit. We replace or sharpen bits after every 2,500 tap holes. So if you've had one you've been using for years and years, and you put a lot of tap holes in trees, it's probably time to retire it or sharpen it and start fresh. You'll see a big difference in how long your battery lasts too. When the bit isn't being used, store it in a plastic sleeve so it doesn't bump up into other bits. Don't just throw it in your toolbox or on your tool bench and have it rattle around with other things. You want it to stay sharp. You wouldn't do that with a good tool or sharp knife. You want to make sure you protect it. Those old bits, if they start to be rusted or damaged, just, you know, get a new one. You want your tap holes to look really, really clean and fresh. Okay, so the next decision you might have to make is, how big of a tap hole am I going to make? The older tap holes are 7/16. In the early 90s, the 5/16, 19/64 tap holes came out, and they actually produce pretty close to the same amount of sap as a 7/16 does, whether it's on gravity or on vacuum. So, but it does make a much smaller hole in the tree, in a much smaller stained area. So by moving to 5/16, we make tapping much more sustainable. Now, 1/4-inch tap holes are something that other people have suggested using, and there may be some occasion to use them, but if you do, you're going to get about a 10 to 11% reduction in yield going from 5/16 to 1/4. It's amazing, just a very, very small difference. You're going to see a loss in sap yield. Moving down further than that, you're going to see even lower yields. So down in the microspout regions, you're down to only about 75 to 80% of the sap yield you get from a 5/16. This work has been verified by some that Senator Acer did. They found exactly the same same amount of drop off in yield from going to 1/4 inch from a 5/16 inch taphole. So most sites, as long as you have reasonable tree growth rates, can support the use of 5/16 inch spouts. But it's important, again, for those suppressed trees, understory trees, to make sure you're thinning them out and allow your crop trees to grow so that they can support tapping over a long period of time. Spout color is one we get asked about a lot. And this is the results of 3 years worth of work where we compared clear, white, and black spouts. And if you just looked at this, you'd say, well, white or black seem to do pretty well. I think I'll use those. Well, that's true. The problem is this is not very consistent. So if you look from year to year, some year white did better and black didn't do as well. Some years black did better and white didn't do as well. Polycarbonate clear always tends to do about the same, and it always tends to be a little lower than white or black, but we tend to like to use polycarbonate. This is the clear polycarbonate, because it is very consistent and because it sticks in the tree very, very well. Polycarbonate just holds in the tree better than nylon. If you could tell me what your season is going to be like, whether it's going to be a hot season or a cold season, then I could help you decide which type of spout to go with, white or black or clear. But we can't predict that far out, so we don't know. If you tend to have a normally cold sugar bush, well, then maybe using a darker colored spout is a good idea. If you have a normally warm sugar bush, using a clear or white might be a better idea. But in general, pick the color that you want. Okay, moving on to taphole depth. This is a study we just finished in 2020. It was 3 years worth of work where we looked at taphole depth across the bottom, and this is syrup yield expressed as a percentage of the 1.5 inch taphole. So 1.5 inch tapholes we set as 100%, and we're looking at all the rest of the tapholes as a function of that. And what you can see, and when I talk about depth here, I'm talking about including the bark. And this is a mixture of trees, everything from about 9 inches, which is our cutoff, up to the largest tree we have, 30 to 40 inches taphole trees. Regardless of that, in general, once you got to about 1.75 to 2 inches deep, you were getting the maximum amount of syrup yield. This is under vacuum. 1 3/4 to 2 inches deep was the maximum yield. So there really isn't any reason to go deeper than that. Now with gravity, a slightly deeper taphole, maybe 2.5 inches, might get you a little bit better, but in that case, you're starting to impact the sustainability of tapping. But with vacuum, 5/16 inch spouts, there's no reason to go any more than 2 inches. It's not going to provide any more benefit. It will create a larger wound, more stained area, and is going to reduce tapping sustainability. So how close do you drill to an old taphole? That's one we get very frequently, and there's not been a lot of research on this. But in general, new tapholes should be drilled no closer than about 2 inches to the side and 6 inches above or below a previous taphole. So not saying 6 inches directly below or above a previous taphole, but a couple inches to the side, 6 inches above or below. Those are minimums. Being further away from that is great if you can do it. If you use high vacuum, probably a good idea to have greater spacing on that. Try to go further away than the minimums. Because there's that stain in there, we find that there's a very high degree of redundancy in sap vessels and the connections between them. So the flow of sap around a stained area really isn't impeded in any way. It's kind of like having a rock in the middle of the stream. You're not going to stop the water unless you have a whole lot of rocks and you have a dam. So we want to have individual pebbles here and there, individual stained areas here and there that we're putting up. As long as we're doing that and we're not staining into that, drilling in those stained areas, then we're fine. The flow rate around those tap holes is going to go a little faster to compensate, and we shouldn't have any type of problem. Well, that brings us to the question of reaming, or what's called bumping in some areas, or retapping. And you may have heard some research that came out a year or so ago on, tapping into the same staining column 8 inches above a previous tap hole, because you wouldn't create any bigger wound, but you get more sap. That's not the case. You do get more sap, but what you're in fact doing, so if you look at these tap holes here, they're 2 inches above. We've been trying this for a number of years at the Proctor Center, and we actually go an additional step and cut these trees up to see what is actually happening. Because the idea is, if we're tapping into that same stained area and getting more sap, that's great. But as it turns out, even tapping just 2 inches above, you're probably just creating a new stained area because the grain isn't the same. And that wound has already started to develop there. So the stain migrates a little bit to one side or the other to try, the flow migrates a little to go around it. And so therefore the stain is going to follow that. So really, even just 2 inches above, you're creating 2 or more times the amount of stain, because those stained areas tend to merge. And you end up not with just double the amount of stain, but more than twice the amount in some cases. And Dr. Vandenberg has a really nice video on this that I would encourage you all to look up. So this is not a technique that we would recommend in any way, reaming or especially the second tap hole or retapping. It will create a bigger stained area within the tree. About tapping straight in at an angle, this has been a big debate over the last 10 years or so in maple. Turns out there's no difference. It doesn't matter whether you drill in straight, drill in an angle, you're going to sever about the same amount of vessels and get the same amount of yield. Drilling at an angle does not create an oval tap hole. You're going to create an oval tap hole by moving the drill when you're actually tapping, by having it move up and down or sideways. A round drill bit cannot create an oval tap hole if it's going straight in and out. So how do we properly tap a tree? Well, first of all, you start by looking at the tree as you're walking up to it. Look at all the sides of it, identify the old tap holes, especially the more recent ones, and avoid them. Select a spot to drill, making sure that you can reach that with your drop line. You don't want to drill a hole and find out your drop line is a little too short to make it. Put the drill on that spot, stabilize the drill with 2 hands, drill at full speed with a sharp bit, one single in and out motion. Should only take a couple of seconds to drill a hole. You should spend a lot more time looking at the tree than you actually spend putting a hole in it. So either a nice pretty picture, unfortunately it's not very good technique. Don't do this. They're using one hand, they're not stable, it's too far over their head, they're going to get tired easily after 100 tap holes, you're so tired. Putting your arms over your head, anytime you do that, the blood isn't getting there as well and you're going to get tired quickly. It's hard to drill straight in and out when you're reaching high over your head. This is what creates oval tap holes. It's going to result in some leaks. You're going to get tired quickly. You should only drill where you can comfortably reach. So this is a tap hole that was drilled up high. You look at it and you say, well, that's pretty good. You can see the bark, the inner bark, and the cambium, and then the wood looks pretty good. But if we look closer and we look at this area, what's that? That's where the drill bit, when they pull it out and pull the drill down, the drill bit tip caught and it was still running. It's running in, out. It created this little score mark. And you put if that score mark is big enough, it's going to create a leak. So make sure you drill only in areas where you can hold it with 2 hands and go straight in and out. This is what creates oval tap holes or poor tap holes. So now we've got the spout, you've chosen your spout, you're putting it in. How far in do you put it? If you put it perfectly in, you're going by sound and by feel. The correct spout seating is really critical. You're seating the spout, you're not driving it in. It's not a nail. You do it by sound, you do it by feel. And we find that it's easier to accomplish this if you use a tapping hammer rather than a framing hammer. We had one of our crew just did not want to use a hammer. He'd had his hammer, he'd used it for 20 years and he wanted to use it. But he'd come back every day and say, I can't believe it. I broke another 10 spouts today. I don't know what the problem is. Everybody else using tap hammer, no problems. He was using his framing hammer. He always broke spouts and he was probably overseeding them. If you drive spouts too deeply, you're going to reduce the area that you can collect sap from and you're going to get lower yields. The same thing on the other side. If you don't drive them in far enough, you're going to have leaks. So it's really kind of a Goldilocks thing. You want to use people who are experienced to put them in the right amount. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 2 tap holes in a tree. If you put a second tap hole in a large tree under gravity, most of the sap is going to come from a different part of the stem. So you might get about twice the amount. But on some trees, if the flow's long enough, the area you're collecting from is going to be very, very slight amount of overlap, and you might get slightly less than twice. Under gravity, though, remember, we're collecting from a larger area. Those tap holes are going to compete for each other. You're going to get less sap than you would from if you just double the amount of sap you're getting from one tap hole. And the amount less you're going to get, it can be considerable. We find that in many cases we're not getting more sap at all if we tap trees that are very close to the limit of size for starting to put one tap in. So this is red maple taps for red maple trees, 1 tap, 2 tap. The blue is the blue bars, first blue bars, 2019, 2020, are how much sap we got from one tree. These trees average 15 inches diameter. And then the 2 tap, we can see that we got just slightly more sap out in 2019, 2020, we didn't get any more sap out of. So tapping trees that are right close to that limit, especially with high vacuum, is not going to yield us a whole lot more sap. So it really probably isn't worth the time and effort and cost. Tap hole height on a tree doesn't seem to make a lot of difference. The aspect that you're collecting sap from doesn't make a lot of difference. This is a couple of years at the Proctor Center, but a lot of research has shown there's been no difference where you tap. Some years you get more from the north, some years more from the south. It really depends on the individual year. And again, you can't tell how the season is going to be till the end of the season. And finally, staining. Just want to talk about staining for a quick minute. When you're tapping, if you hit stain, it's going to reduce the yield on a 1-to-1 basis. And you're going to end up with, if you hit 50% stain, you're going to get 50% less sap. And it has an impact over the entire sugar bush. You need to avoid those tap holes. So this is what the experience we had at the Proctor Center. 2014, we were tapping. We were trying to be careful, but we were still hitting old stain about 4.7% of the time. And we total up the loss over the entire sugar bush, we were losing $1,600 at bulk prices, or 32 cents a tap due to hitting stain across. That's not just the stain trees, that's every tree. On average, we were losing 32 cents per tap across the entire sugar bush just from hitting stained wood. So we switched to tapping below the lateral in some cases, being more careful, especially on those old trees that have been tapped for a long period of time. And we've been able to get better and better at reducing the amount of stain we're hitting, so that by 2020, we were only hitting stain about 3.3% of the time. We reduced the amount of stain we hit tremendously. We were only losing 3 cents per tap across our sugar bush. So you can sort of think about this as when you're walking up to a tree and you see 32 cents laying on the ground, are you going to pick it up? Well, just those few extra seconds are worth doing because you're going to save a lot of money doing it. It's really hard to stress the importance of not hitting stain enough. So what you should do is look at your drill shavings when you're tapping to determine how often you're hitting stain. You don't have to do this every time, but do it fairly often, especially in those areas that have been tapped for a long period of time. If you're having problems, alter your practices to avoid hitting stained wood. So use shallower tap holes, smaller tap holes, tap below the lateral if you can, if you're on vacuum. Reduce the amount of stained wood, and that's going to reduce the hit to your pocketbook. Gonna finish up by just saying that to help you decide on some of these things is a tool called the tapping zone model, which you can find on mapleresearch.org that we've put together. And you can look at what your current practices are and what sort of changes you might want to do and see what you might want to find. So what you're trying to do is in this red box and the green box right next to it, trying to have the highest number possible. So the least percentage of time that you're going to hit stain is a good thing. So just as one example of using 24-inch drop lines versus 13 or 36-inch drop lines, 24-inch drop lines, you're going to have a 13% chance of hitting stained wood after 25 years. 36-inch drop line, you've dropped it by about half of hitting stained wood. So with that, I'm going to end here just by saying there are a lot of different resources out there. Mapleresearch.org from the North American that UVM helped build. The Proctor channel, YouTube channel, UVM Maple Extension, UVM Extension Maple Business Program. And if you go and visit a lot of those, you'll find a lot of tips and hints and tools on how to increase your sap yields. So with that, I'm going to stop and see if I have any time for questions.
Thank you, Tim. We do have a few questions that came in. I'll just read them to you here.
Okay.
If using good sanitation practices and we tap in mid-January, we will be losing. Oh, it just moved. I lost the question. I'm going to go to another one and find that one while you're answering this last one. There was a question about the slide presentations, if it'll be available on the website, and we'll put them on wizmaple.org when after the presentations are over, probably sometime in the next weeks or so, but they'll be available there.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to go on to the one I can see. You mentioned oval tap holes. Any solid research showing on the precision tapper actually correcting this and improving a technique, or just manufacturers' sales videos on it? So he's wondering about that precision tapper.
Yeah, we've used them, and we haven't done any research studies on them per se, but we have tried them, and in some cases, when particularly with this depth study, when we wanted to get perfect depths and exactly the same tap holes every time, we did actually use them. We tend to use only tappers who are very experienced. It's like the job you have to earn over a period of time. And so those people say that it actually slows them down a little bit. But for people who are less experienced, it's probably helpful, but it's going to make you a little slower. But they can be helpful if you're not quite as experienced. The very experienced people probably, they don't require them.
Thank you. Another question, can you comment on the research that suggests one can use smaller trees with smaller taps? Yeah, you know, in the single tap and as it kind of goes with the crown of the tree as well. How does that work with yield?
They're all kind of related. Small trees, but I guess the first thing I would say is if you're going to tap small trees, your first thing ought to be, should I thin these trees out? That's going to get the best growth on the crop trees. Having a really dense, dog hair forest and tapping hundreds and hundreds of really tiny trees is not going to be as good as thinning the crop trees and tapping those. But if you, for one reason or another, maybe drought or poor soils or other reasons, have slow growing trees, and using smaller spouts, 1/4 inch, might not be a bad idea. There's a good amount of research on this, and I'd encourage everybody, when you have questions, if you can't answer them today, go to mapleresearch.org and type in your question or keywords in there. You're going to find a lot of papers, a lot of resources on those types of questions. Or email me. I don't have a question with email questions, or ask on Maple Trader.
Thank you. If using good sanitation practices and we tap in mid-January, will we lose anything in sap production at the end of the season when the sap flow is best?
The evidence is that it depends on how good your sanitation is, and it depends on how good your vacuum is and vacuum practices are, and how the season plays out. So it's a little difficult to answer, but you tend to have a higher risk of losing sap by sap that you never collect to begin with. So those flows that happen in mid to late January, early February, if you lose those, they're gone forever. So, hoping for a windfall later in the season is risky, whereas we know we can tap in for our site, at least in mid-January, and still have good flows to the end of the season. We're seeing good flows right up to the end of the time that we have freeze thaw periods by tapping in January with good sanitation, with good vacuum management.
Good. Okay, the next question. Tapping under the lateral line, does the vacuum have to be on 24/7? Are there other things to keep in mind for this technique?
Yep, again, there's a paper on this and lots of information, but if you're tapping below lateral, the important things are you got to have vacuum and you got to have really good sanitation. So don't try it without those two things. You should never shut your vacuum off unless the trees are frozen up and the tubing system is frozen up. Because if you shut it off when there's liquid in the line, that liquid is going to run back into the tree, pulling microbes back in. So those things are very important all the time, but they're especially important when you tap below the lateral line. Tapping below the lateral line, though, does work very well because you have a tapping band that's never been accessed before.
Good, thank you. We've got a couple more here. When sugar drops off late season, should you shut it down for tree health, keep going till it's buddy? Will it go back up?
The trend over the season, and again, there was a paper, I think it just came out in Maple News a month or so ago that looked at the trends and the typical trends in sugar content at our site, which are pretty much the same as everybody else. It tends to be a little low early on, peaks within the first third of the season, and then steadily drops off with these maybe small bumps up over the season as you continue. It probably won't come back up a lot during the end of the season. So don't hope for that. I don't know if I answered the question or not, but
I think that's good. Next question. With your comment on dropline length, if a person is setting up lines for the first time, can they expect to just pre-cut a bunch of drop lines at 36 inches to speed the process up?
Sure, that's the way we do it. Bring pre-assembled drops with a T and the spout right into the woods.
Okay, is it a problem to knock off a small area of bark before drilling a tap hole?
Yeah, I wouldn't scrape right down very far, but if there's a big flake on these old trees, then go ahead. But we don't do it as a normal course of action. It's only if we look around the tree and can't find another good spot except one that's got a big flake on it. I saw somebody ask about my email address. It's timothy.perkins@uvm.edu.
Thanks for that. There's another question about if you're tapping your tree and you noticeably hit a piece of stained wood, should you drill a second hole or is it better not to?
Well, that's a tough one. If it's a tree that's already peppered and you're having a hard time finding spot to begin with, I would say don't tap it again. Change your practice, do something else next year. Just cap that off, plug it, and move on. If you only hit a little bit of stain, then leave the tap. Put the tap in the tree, and maybe you'll get 75-80% out of it. But try to avoid. You're gonna hit stain sometime. What you want to do is try to minimize the time you hit it. You can't avoid it every time unless it's brand new woods.
Thank you. The last question it looks like we have is, do check valves keep the sanitation when tapping below the lateral line?
Yeah, they do. In fact, they help to. It's a tool that's going to help to do just that. Nothing is perfect, especially any mechanical thing. It will certainly help. If you go back and look at that paper, we did it with regular drop lines, regular spouts, and we did some with check valves, and the check valves did add an extra amount of sanitation to it. So they did end up with an extra amount of sap for yield as well.
We have one last question. Is alcohol legal to use in tubing for cleaning?
Listen very carefully. In the US, no. In Canada, you're fine. IPA is allowed. Now, you get this question a lot. It is not us that's making the determination. It's the federal government. Using any type of sanitizer is regulated by the EPA as a pesticide. So if you're using isopropyl alcohol, you are using an unregistered pesticide in the preparation of food. That's, if you can't guess, that's really bad. That's really bad. There's nothing stopping any manufacturer from going to the EPA, providing the studies, and getting it licensed. They're just going to have to pay to do it. None of them have done it so far. On the research for IPA, I'll just answer that a little further. It falls out somewhere between a new spout and a new dropper check valve. It's about halfway in between.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. I think that's kind of all the time we have today, but really appreciate your expertise and your time to spend with us this morning.